Love it when an episode is sponsored by a product I already use. I've been using NordVPN for years now because, frankly, a VPN is pretty much a requirement when you travel as much as I do, or travel at all, to be completely honest with you. NordVPN allows me to watch my favorite Netflix shows and other streaming content without worrying if the show is available in whatever country I'm in. No more of those frustrating geographic restrictions on the shows that I want to watch. And perhaps most importantly, at least for me, NordVPN protects my data when I'm using those sketchy airport and coffee shop Wi-Fi connections in whatever far-flung corner of the planet I'm lucky enough to find myself in. Go to nordvpn.com/attaché or use promo code Attaché, that's ATTACHE, to get a heck of a discount on a 2-year plan and 1 month free.
Okay.
This is exciting.
I'm glad that we're recording this.
Hello? I can't see anything. This is the future, man. Hi.
Do you feel safer?
Yeah.
This is Joseph Tame. Joseph is our Tokyo-based producer and a video creator in his own right. This is the first time we've seen him since the COVID outbreak. And I think if we were to have seen this conversation a year ago, it would have confused the hell out of us. The world has changed and Japan is different. We wanted to catch up with Joseph to see how he and the country were faring nearly a year into the pandemic. So, Joseph, we have been to Tokyo with you a lot, and I miss it terribly, and I think it's the country I miss the most since they've said that we can't travel. We look to Asia and we see how you guys seem to be crushing it, and life seems reasonably normal. And I want to ask you about that, but it's been almost a year now. When did you get the first sign that this is a lot bigger than perhaps we first thought it might be?
So initially here in Japan, people were pretty worried because, of course, we're pretty close to China and there's a lot of tourism between China and Japan, a lot of business. And so we were kind of just waiting for cases to arise in Japan. But then it never really took off in those early days, and we were just reading reports about, say, Italy and so forth. So it wasn't really that real for the first few weeks or so. I mean, I guess like everywhere in the world. But when it really struck home was actually when it came to the Tokyo Marathon. So I've run the Tokyo Marathon for 11 years, and it's a really core part of my life. It kind of charges my batteries for the year. It's that time when Tokyo really unites, comes together as over 1 million people on the street, and it's just a fantastic event. And so when the rumors started circulating that the Tokyo Marathon might be cancelled, it was like, what? No way, you've got to be kidding me. Because at that point, we hadn't seen major events cancelled. And then when the news came through that it was cancelled, we were pretty shocked. It was like, whoa, this is serious. And that was really that point where you realize that life is not going to go on as normal. This is not just like some other issue we've seen before, but fundamentally it's going to change what we can do. Work kind of stopped. We do video production, all shoots were off. Everything just stopped. And it was it was a big shock. I remember talking with taxi drivers whose business had just been completely decimated, saying how basically they had never seen anything like this before. Of course, all the large corporations that we work with, I mean, suddenly they all switched to work from home. And it was extraordinary to see that change in Japan, where typically, it's a country of where if you need to sign a document, you need the stamp. You need to hand over pieces of paper. You need to go round to the boss's office and have things signed off. So really not geared up at all for remote work and so forth, and so a lot of conservative organisations, and it was a big shock for everyone.
Do you think, Joseph, that's irreversible? Like, do you feel like Japan will now have moved on from that sort of bureaucratic, paper-led system? Do you think they'll clamber back to it because that's a comfort zone?
I think that this is a real opportunity for change, and we already see that change taking place. So the government has set up a new, I can't remember if it's a task force or the new guy who is in charge of reform. And he has announced that he is going to do away with the hanko, do away with the stamp. Government,
Wow.
yeah. And who knows, maybe fax machines, maybe they will start being retired. We don't want to count our chickens, but fax machines still seem to be pretty popular here. There is real change. I don't think we're going to go back to how we were before. I think businesses as well, they may be asking workers to go in 3 days a week or 4 days a week. But it's proven that society can operate, can keep going, where people don't all have to cram onto rush hour trains every morning, pile into an office. It's not necessary. So I think in the long term, this is going to have a big positive impact on the way that Japanese society, especially work culture, operates.
I want to go back to the crowded trains thing and just the pace of life in general. I mean, Tokyo is, the first time I went there, I was overwhelmed just by the sheer volume of people and the kind of cacophony of life. When there were first rumblings and you were sort of glancing across the Sea of Japan to China and seeing this potential threat, did people take it seriously? Were people talking about it on the street? And when it became clear that this was going to be on Japan's shores imminently, did you go into lockdown? And what was that like? What was the contrast like, if there was any?
Yeah, it was a pretty big change, and it happened over a relatively short period of time. I mean, I remember in early January we started thinking about maybe people were going to have to work from home, and what we were thinking was kind of a reflection of what was going on around us in society. And then over the space of about 3 weeks, it became really clear what was going to happen. At least since the 1960s, people in Japan have, tended to go with the flow, go with what others do, and not be the nail that sticks out. In Japan also, of course, or especially in Tokyo, where there's a lot of people in a very limited space, people do tend to try and respect other people's personal space. They'll wear face masks. So some of those behaviors, like being obedient in public, were already kind of a part of Japanese life. So things like wearing masks, following the rules when companies ask people to stay home, or when the government asks people to stay home, not go out after 8 p.m. People followed those, and there wasn't much fuss about it. It was kind of an extension of what had been done until now. In Japan, the government doesn't have any teeth to make people behave in certain ways because of the constitution. That means that it can't really fine companies or individuals for breaking so-called lockdown rules, because it's only a soft lockdown. It's a polite request to please not go out after 8 p.m, please work from home. If a company decides to continue operating when it's been asked to close, it will be named and shamed. So that's the extent. There's no fines.
So there's no punitive. Wow. Okay. So no punitive measures, no punishments. But when this recommendation, this soft lockdown, was implemented, how were the streets empty? I mean, I can't imagine Tokyo without just constant flow of people.
When the first lockdown was implemented, it did have a very immediate effect on the streets of Tokyo. You would go out, and where you'd normally see places just bustling with people and traffic, there was no one. It was extraordinary. The only time I've seen something similar is when there's been like New Year holiday or in the summer where everyone goes away to the countryside to see their ancestors or their relatives. Yeah, it was like a movie set. It was extraordinary for a place like Tokyo where suddenly the trains were empty, the streets were empty, the shops were closed. It was quite stunning.
So, how did the media portray it?
The media coverage, it just naturally progressed as it has anywhere else around the world, I think, and gradually it becomes more serious. And recently, the media's become increasingly critical of the government for not taking the action that it should be taking, as cases have been rising in Japan. But generally, in Japan, since the COVID situation arose, it never got that bad. We were typically seeing a few hundred cases a day for much of 2020. And it was only at the end of the year, as winter came on, just like we've seen in other countries, the second wave. And that second wave has been, it's relatively bad now. Compared to other countries, it's still very good. But it's, many more people than 2020.
Do you think that generally at the beginning people were taking it seriously and not staying home out of a sense of duty, but out of a sense of fear?
There was definitely a sense of fear when COVID first came about, when we started realizing how serious it was, because everyone knew there was no treatment, and we all knew that the hospitals were not geared up for it at all. It wasn't just out of a sense of duty or trying not to, go against the flow of society, but there was genuine fear, and I saw that in my community as well, in our company and friends around us. People genuinely wanted to stay at home because out of fear of catching COVID. So it was that combination of genuine fear and just following the advice that was being given.
So it's been, for you anyway, nearly a year, or over a year now, since this has been part of life. What's the situation like now? What's open? What's not open? Are there people back on the street? What's the mood like?
Of course, people are really tired of it. How long do we have to, be isolating and just staying away from one another? But because it's on the rise with winter, there is a renewed sense of fear. People are increasingly hearing about people in their communities who've got coronavirus, which wasn't happening last year. But now we've been seeing, over 1,000 cases a day in Tokyo. More and more people now know people in their community who have it. So I think people are generally, they're out and about a lot more than they were at the start of the pandemic, partly because they're tired of it, but partly because there's precautions in place. You can't go into any shop, into any convenience store without, there being sheets of plastic in front of the register. Restaurants have screens and things, although you have to wonder if they have any impact at all. And of course, we have politicians who are going out to clubs and things in the evenings when they're telling everyone else not to. So we've got the usual stories in the media that we see elsewhere. So it's a mixed bag.
I know that here in England, there's a vibe that as soon as we can, we'll leap back into normality. Do you think Japan and its culture would keep those plastic screens up in shops? And kind of keep that going as like a renewed kind of appreciation for hygiene, because they were wearing masks, like you say, like way before there was even a pandemic. Is that going to have a lasting effect?
That's a really great question, and I truly hope that when this is over, all of those screens will go away. My suspicion is that they won't, though. And I think one thing is the pandemic is not going to suddenly end overnight, right? It's going to take months for the vaccination to roll out across society. In Japan, the vaccines are coming pretty late. We're going to be waiting until at least March before we see the first ones, because the tests, the trials that have been done on vaccines in other countries, they have to be redone for Japan, in Japan. So we haven't got any vaccines yet. My gut feeling is it's going to be a long time before the restrictions are lifted. Of course, in Japan, there's another key factor in the response to COVID, and that's the Tokyo Olympics. It's suspected by many people that the government is not willing to be so proactive in enforcing lockdowns and so forth, because they want the Olympics to go ahead. And if they were to admit that it's a really dire situation here, then that puts them in a very tricky situation. They can't really say, oh no, it's all fine here, you know. A lot of people aren't very happy with that. The surveys are showing that the majority of Japanese want the Olympics to be cancelled. I was just thinking about it today. I mean, how on earth are they going to make sure the Olympics is safe? I can't see it happening personally.
And aren't the borders completely closed?
I'm not sure if the borders are completely closed right now, because the rules are constantly changing, kind of similar to the UK. The border rules have been a real issue, especially for non-Japanese living in Japan. Over the summer of 2020, even if you were a permanent resident with family and, say, a business, say someone like myself, if I left Japan, I could not get back in. No way I could get back in, because the rule was that if you're not Japanese, you can't come back in, even if you've gone to the same countries for the same length of time as a Japanese person. There was a lot of lobbying on behalf of international companies because their staff are stuck in or out of Japan, but it took quite a long time for the government to change that rule, and they later said it was simply because they didn't have the facilities to manage many people coming in from overseas. So I know that with the Olympics they would have had more time to prepare, but I don't see how it's practical. What if there was a big outbreak?
When it comes to national travel currently, is everything operational? Are the Shinkansen going to the different areas, islands? They are.
Yeah, national travel really hasn't been affected at all throughout the entire time. The government even had a campaign called Go To Travel, which was promoting domestic travel even while COVID was ongoing. Cases were getting really bad in Tokyo in December. It was still going on. They've temporarily paused it. But I mean, it's this thing of trying to promote the economy over dealing with the pandemic, and there's many arguments as to what you should do and how it's impacting people in different ways. But generally, a lot of things have carried on as usual, but the trains have generally been a lot emptier because of the fear and people being asked to stay at home.
It's interesting to me that you're talking about this period of things being closed as if it's a distant memory, which makes it sound like you haven't experienced what much of the rest of the world have experienced, with going in and out of these lockdowns and restaurants and pubs and bars and gyms and hairdressers all closing and then opening and then closing again. How is that possible? What is Japan and arguably Singapore and Hong Kong and Taiwan, Australia, doing differently than the rest of us?
It's a great question. What is Japan doing differently from the rest of the world? And I don't think there's any clear answer. We have not been through those periods of severe lockdowns, and it hasn't felt necessary because the numbers have remained up until December fairly stable. And even now, yes, there are 1,000 cases a day in Tokyo. That still doesn't feel like that many, to be honest, for a place the size of Tokyo. I think initially it certainly helped that everyone obeyed the soft lockdown, that people have always worn masks, people have avoided public transport, good hygiene, and washing your hands and things. For me, if I compare myself, like my life in the UK and childhood with here, like here we seem to wash our hands much more anyway. We take our shoes off when we go into the house. I know that's not related to COVID, but it's just an example of how generally hygiene here seems to generally be better. There's been very few protests, people like bucking the trend. There was one politician who was competing against the governor of Tokyo, and his poster, it said like coronavirus is a hoax, and that was his campaign. He didn't get elected, so instead he went to Shibuya Crossing and had a demo there, and then him and his supporters got on the Yamanote line without masks and were deliberately kind of proving that they're not afraid. That is a real exception. Most people are obeying the rules. If people post about having parties or whatever, generally they can often be shamed. So I think that shame culture, which is definitely more of a thing here in Japan than it is overseas, is a big thing. Why would you want to put yourself in that situation of making a lot of people feel very uncomfortable? It's not that big of a sacrifice to wear a mask and observe social distance.
If you were to go out and have dinner tonight, what's the dining experience like these days as opposed to before the pandemic? Has it changed notably?
The dining experience in Tokyo hasn't really changed much, except you will have clear perspex barriers between you and the next table. Maybe the tables might be slightly further apart. At the cashier, they'll have a clear curtain. But to be honest, like when I walk home and I walk by some of these really tiny little restaurants, it's like, my God, like that is the perfect place to go and get COVID. Like, seriously, those little perspex things are not going to make the blindest bit of difference if you're sitting, a meter and a half away from someone who's breathing next to you. But then businesses, they're going to suffer if they close. So it's all a case of what risk are you prepared to take? And it's not clear what you should do.
And Piss Alley, is it relatively the same? I just think of these really claustrophobic, I love it, but like these tight spaces, which are obviously the worst nightmare for COVID, are they still just operating?
I believe they're pretty much operating as normal, except they would close at 8 p.m. They probably have some kind of perspex barriers in place, or they limit the number of customers. But it's hard to limit the number of customers when your bar only seats 4 people anyway. But I imagine it's been really tough. Yeah. In March 2020, that's when the cherry blossoms started coming out at the end of the month, and things were really bad then. So everyone was staying indoors, and yet the cherry blossom season in Japan, as anyone knows who's been here, it's huge. It's that time when after a long winter you go out and you take your blue tarpaulin, sit under the trees with your friends, your colleagues, drink beer, and just celebrate the spring. And yet this year, we all had to stay indoors and the parks were empty, and you could imagine all this cherry blossom that nobody saw, and then it snowed and it rained and it all fell and it was lost. I hope that this year, by the time the cherry blossoms come about, we start to see some hope. And I'm sure we won't have the same big parties as you would usually have, but I hope that at least we're able to see some of them in some limited way.
And the marathon, what hope for the marathon?
The Tokyo Marathon has been rescheduled for October 2021. Anyone who entered the previous marathon has been automatically given a place in that, so I'm registered. I really hope it goes ahead. I think it's going to depend a lot on what we see happening over the summer with the Olympics. If the Olympics go ahead, that means they must have figured out a way to make these things happen, and then the marathon will go ahead. And I think it's going to be such a huge celebration. We're back. Tokyo's event is back, and the city really does become one on that day. So I hope that I'm running those streets with over 1 million people cheering us on, and looking forward to it.
Will you run it in your new mask?
Yeah, because it's so practical. Why not? It's the perfect running gear.
It is quite clear that Japan has changed dramatically since we were last with Joseph. The country, the world, feels somewhat alien to what we knew just a year ago. And while we don't know what is waiting for us on the other side of the pandemic, listening to Joseph, it's clear that irrespective of our geography, we share a common fear, a common experience, and, one might say, a common hope. And perhaps in some way, will emerge a smaller, more united community.